Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. I'm going to start off by asking a few questions, jumping around a few different areas, and then we're going to throw things open to the audience. And in terms of a place to start, I want to start with what's happened this week. On Monday, you presided over a summit of the Eurogroup that was considering the situation in Greece, considering releasing an additional €5 billion in loans to Greece. And you also mentioned the possibility of reducing the debt burden on Greece, having some kind of restructuring process going on. Is that because Greece has failed to make substantial progress over the last year with regards to its austerity programmes?
No, I think Greece, ever since the deal that we struck last summer, well, maybe I should go back a little further. We had this, the second program of Greece basically crashed at the end of 2014, and then there were new elections, and a new government came in, and Greece basically went full back into recession. The budget went completely off track. Growth disappeared again, and we were in full crisis mode last summer. Then we struck a new deal with, yes, more reform, yes, sorting out the budget again, and more cheap loans. And I have to say that ever since the summer, our cooperation has been much more productive and constructive. And that's why I think the time is also right to start talking about debt relief. The Greek debt is very high, and given the weakness of its economy, that is a major sort of challenge. Challenge is a small word for a big issue. So I think the time has come, now that the program is well on track and a lot of difficult stuff has been done, to start talking about the debt issue.
Obviously, you're in favour of some kind of restructuring. Lots of countries are not. Mr. Schäuble is very opposed to any sort of restructuring. Do you think that it's likely there'll be a debt restructuring and that it'll be possible to get around the disagreements that some of the northern European countries have?
Well, my country has always been very sort of restrictive where debt restructuring is concerned, but I think that the principle that we don't write off debt, don't do haircuts, that is still very much guarded. But having said that, the debt burden for a country consists not only of the sort of the nominal size of the debt, but also, of course, when do you have to pay it and what interests do you have to pay on it. So there are different ways to bring down the debt burden. We've already done a lot. At the end of 2012, we've reduced interest rates and lengthened maturity periods. And that's the kind of things we're looking at again. So yes, I'm in favor of that. I think it can be done. There are different ways to sort of reprofile the debt and make it better manageable for the Greeks. And yes, I do believe we'll get a deal on that in a couple of weeks.
In a couple of weeks?
Well, the next Eurogroup is the 24th of May. And there is a strong sense that none of us, for many different reasons, want to go back into sort of a crisis situation which we had last summer. It's damaging for the Eurozone, it's damaging for the confidence in the outside world in the Eurozone, and it's of course very damaging to Greece. There are plenty of challenges in Europe at the moment, migration, populism, etc. We don't need another crisis on top of that. So let's sort it out, make sure that Greece gets back on track, stabilizing the whole position, and dealing with debt is inevitably a part of that.
So do you believe then that if there is a restructuring deal, whatever form it ends up taking, that will, at least in the short run, solve the Greece's position within the Eurozone?
It's not just about debt, because let's say we drastically reduce the debt burden for the Greeks, then still everything could immediately go back off track. So it's also about sticking to, you know, a well-managed budget, making sure that investors see investment opportunities in Greece and come back to Greece. So it's not just about the confidence between the countries of the Eurozone, it's also about the confidence of citizens, businesses, investors in Greece. And that requires sensible economic policy and a lot of stability. Stability, I think, in many of our countries, all of our countries, political stability, economic stability is sort of the key factor for investors to step in or to quickly leave. And that's also very true for Greece.
You mentioned how Greece's debt situation is just one of the many problems in Europe, migration being another key issue. And it's those issues in the Eurozone, in the European Union more widely, that has led a large movement in the United Kingdom to say that they'd like to leave the European Union. Of course, we have our referendum coming up on the 23rd of June. Do you understand the reasons why some people in this country would like to vote to leave the European Union?
No, but I do understand. I do understand a lot of the criticism on how the EU functions, and I think the way we've developed the European Union very much explains that. We've built the EU by taking big steps, big historic steps. Every now and then we did, for example, the expansion of the number of member states in big steps. The deepening of the union by starting the monetary union, another big step. Getting rid of interior borders, the Schengen Agreement, another big step. But the problem very often was that we failed to complete the new setup. We failed to complete the monetary union and make it strong. We failed to have outside border controls. If you get rid of inside border controls, you should have outside border controls. Anyone can understand it, but we didn't do it. And there have been many of these examples which has made the functioning of the European Union weak. We should finish the things that we do. It's all right to build a union by taking on projects, but finish the project and make sure that it doesn't take you by surprise in the next crisis. And then, so if you have a monetary union, I think you should also have a banking union with common banking rules and strict standards and common supervision. I think that's also part of having one internal market. But we didn't build the banking union till after the financial crisis. So I'd say let's really finish the projects that we have and that we have started in the European Union so that the union becomes strong and functions well. And that will be my answer to those that say it doesn't function well.
But you must at least understand the concern that the EU is becoming increasingly integrated, increasingly focused around the countries which have the single currency, leaving little room actually for those countries which don't want to become more integrated, which want to retain a bit more of their independence.
I'm not sure that's true. To give you the example of the banking union, we did that by starting with the EU 28 to design sort of the common rules. We call that the single rule book for the banking sector. And we reached an agreement which was of great value to all of us, also to London. London is the largest financial centre in Europe. And it's of great interest to London that there are sort of common capital requirements, common supervisory standards for all the banking institutions and all the financial markets in Europe. And on top of that, some countries said, okay, it will be even better if we have a joint supervisor. And the Brits said, well, that goes a little too far. We'll stay out. We'll let the Bank of England do that. Fine. So I think it's possible to still be a full and committed member of the EU 28 without necessarily being part of the banking union or the monetary union. And maybe at some point in the future, if the banking union turns out to work very well, other countries will join. Denmark is seriously contemplating to join the banking union, even though they're not a euro country. So Europe has different speeds and different projects, and yes, it's possible to be part of some of the projects, to be leading in other projects, and to be out of another project. I think that can work.
And do you think the economic consequences of a British exit, would they be worse for Britain or would they be worse for the EU?
I'm hesitant to answer that because it sounds always like I'm coming here to warn you off, and I don't want to do that.
You don't want to be Obama.
So we don't know. I think it will be probably damaging to both of us. I'm from the Netherlands. We have strong economic and financial relationships with the UK. You are an important export market, and continental Europe is an important market, the most important market, I would presume, for the UK. So obviously there will be effects, and political instability is always bad for economy. Always, I'm sure of it.
But isn't it precisely because of that, because we do depend on one another, that if Britain were to vote to leave, you would be part of the team that would then negotiate the kind of deals that follow a British exit? Would there not obviously therefore be a deals made so that Britain carries on trading with the EU in many of the same ways it does now?
There have to be deals, because we will keep on trading. Because now we are all part of the same rules in the same markets. You don't have to have all the separate rules between us. And that will change, and that will make it a lot more complex and therefore more costly. Many advantages of free trade won't be available. But of course, I don't know how the trade agreements will work out. I think you've had in the UK a lot of debate. Are we going to be Norway? Are we going to be Switzerland? Are we going to be Canada? I don't know. Neither are very attractive. If you're Norway, you have to comply to all the EU rules, but you can't be part of the decision making, and you have to pay to the EU. If you're Switzerland, you have to have numerous agreements on all different topics. I think Switzerland has about 19 or something like this. There are different models to do it. It's all complex. It's for businesses definitely more costly than it is now. And there are many disadvantages. And I would prefer not just that the UK stays in the EU. That's not good enough for me. I want the UK to be a very active and involved member of the EU. I'm part of the ECOFIN as Minister of Finance. I now chair the ECOFIN. I want the British Minister to be at the front of all the discussions and the debates, because the interests of Britain are every month on the top of our agenda, because we do all the financial markets, financial services, regulations, single rule book, everything about bank regulations, etc. And London is the most important driver of the British economy, and in London the financial sector, I think, is still the biggest driver of the economy. So there is a huge interest for the British Minister of Finance to be not just in the room, stay a member, but to be very actively involved, to be leading. And that would be also in my interest, to be quite frank.
And would you worry that a potential British exit would then set a precedent for other countries also to want to leave?
That might actually happen. I don't know. The criticism of how the EU functions and what it delivers for citizens is not just a British issue. I mean, it's everywhere. We have a lot of Euroscepticism in my country. But you'll hear it also in the south of Europe. We have Marine Le Pen, who is leading in the polls in France. Alternative für Deutschland is coming up in Germany. So the sense of criticism, what's this Europe? Why are they interfering in our lives? Why are they telling us what to do? And what does it actually bring to us? That is a real debate everywhere. So also here I would say, to my British friends, stay in and be part of that debate, because it's not just a British debate. We want the EU to function better and to deliver more for citizens. And that's a joint interest.
Well, enough of talking about our problems. Let's talk about some of your problems. And
I thought these were my problems.
According to the latest Dutch opinion polls, your party, the Labour Party in the Netherlands, is set to lose 3/4 of its seats,
yep.
Making it only the 7th largest party in the Dutch parliament after the next general election.
This is only polls, people. It's only polls, don't worry.
Polls are famously inaccurate, and we can live in hope, but nonetheless, what do you see as the reason for that? And do you think that the demise of your party, is that primarily a Dutch problem, or is it a more European thing that we're seeing, a kind of shift away from the mainstream left, like we've also seen in France and in Britain?
Yeah, I think it's not just away from the mainstream left. I think it's away from the mainstream, full stop. And it's not just in Europe. I think it's also in the US. So if you look at the American elections at the moment, it's a lot of voters are shifting to the fringes. And the whole debate throughout Europe and in the US is becoming much more radicalized, polarized. people don't just want to hear a sort of a moderate left-wing politician. If they're left-wing, they want the real thing. They want to go all the way. And that's great, until you're in office, and then you have to make it work. And I don't think that will change. And so I think one of the reasons why we in the Netherlands are in such dire straits, at least in the polls, is that we did some major reforms. We had a very deep economic crisis, even more so than other neighboring countries, due to a terrible housing market, pension system which had many failures, and a healthcare system which was, financially at least, completely out of control. So we did major reforms on all of these issues, and that doesn't make you popular from whatever party you are in and in whatever country you are in. If you really start changing the healthcare system, if you really start changing things in the pension system, people get very upset. But we had no choice. Our economy was really in the slumps. Our budget was completely off track, and we sorted it out. Maybe we did it too fast. Maybe we did it too. But I think I don't regret it at all. Our economy's now one of the strongest economies in the Eurozone again. After being right at the bottom, we're back in the top group again. Our budget is sorted out, and our debt is going down quickly, and unemployment is going down. So we have radically changed the sort of economic perspective. But in the process, there is a lot of unrest and unease and insecurity in society. Maybe we've underestimated it, but I don't think we had a choice given the crisis that we were in.
Well, speaking of that shift towards more extremist parties, Geert Wilders and his xenophobic anti-immigration Freedom Party are set to become the largest party after the next election, with almost twice as many seats as any potential runner-up. Do you see Mr. Wilders as a threat to Dutch tolerance and to Dutch openness?
Oh, absolutely. He is, if you listen to him, because he doesn't only want to leave the EU. He wants to literally close the borders for Muslims. He wants less Moroccans in our country. We have a very large group of Moroccan Dutch citizens ever since the 60s and the 70s. And he talks about getting rid of people. I mean, this is the kind of politician he is.
He sounds like a certain politician in America at the moment.
Yeah, but even more extreme, I would say. Yet he's been in the polls very high before, and at election time, people always, at least a lot of people always come to their senses because they start to think, all right, I'm very annoyed, to put it politely, with the current government, and I'm very fed up with the current Minister of Finance. But do I really want Geert Wilders to take office? Do I really want him to run this country? And a lot of people sort of, on election day, think, well, maybe not. So, it's very much about whether we are, and that's always, in election time, it's not about what you have achieved. If we were to go into elections saying, oh, look what we've done, we've sorted out all these problems and the unemployment is going down, we've done so well. I think people simply expect you to sort out problems. That's why you're in office. They want to hear what's the plan for the future, so what's the perspective? And talking about perspective, this is where we need to beat the populist right. The perspective should be about rejuvenating, is that English word? The economy. The perspective should be about cooperation rather than withdrawing behind our dikes. We have a lot of dikes. So I think in the campaign it will be much more about the perspective that you can offer people. And it should be a positive perspective against a negative perspective about we are being threatened by migrants and we're being threatened by foreigners. And so I think that's what I'm in politics for, to talk about a positive perspective for people rather than just introducing fear and scaring people off.
Thank you. We're going to open up to questions from the audience now. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand up high and wait for the microphone to come around to you. We'll start off with a question from the gentleman in the blue jacket.
No, you spoke a bit towards the end about xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and sometimes racist parties that are gaining massive amounts of prominence in today's political system. Do you think that the people voting for them, most of them are just xenophobic and racist? Do you think it's just a form of rebellion against the system or something completely different?
It's certainly a form of rebellion against the system, but it does have to do with the issue. It does have to do with migration. I think many of the benefits of globalization and opening up borders are visible in our society, but have gone to a very small part of our society. If you go to the largest cities in the Netherlands, you will find that all the migrants are living in a quite concentrated, dense areas of the city with the cheapest houses, which are already socially quite weak and vulnerable areas. Whereas the benefits of this open society and globalization have gone to other parts of the city, the outskirts where the villas are. So there is really an issue here. I think in the past we've been naive about the difficulties of migration, and I don't think we can afford that anymore. So that's why I said, when you take away the interior borders, you have to set up outside borders. I think any political region needs to be able to protect its collectivity. So I'm a social democrat. I believe very strongly in solidarity. And we've organized our solidarity in many of the Northwest European countries in strong social systems. We have social security, we have national health care, we have pension systems. But having these kind of collective systems of solidarity requires that you define who's part of that and who's not. And migration is a great challenge, to put it mildly. You could also say, if you have a large influx of migrants, it is a threat to this kind of system. It really requires adjustments, and it puts a lot of stress on labour markets, on pension system, on welfare system. And I don't think we can't afford to underestimate that, and we have to take those issues seriously. We in the Netherlands have done very poorly in the past in integrating newcomers in our society. It's been very difficult for newcomers to actually get into the labour market and get a real sort of labour market perspective. And we need to improve that, because otherwise the social burden of migration and the influx of new low-skilled workers will all be in those areas in the city that I just talked about. And if we don't manage that better and have better policies to integrate people, but also have better border protection to manage migration, I'm sure that Wilders will become the largest party one day in history. And so the issue is real. The way he talks about it and his answers are rubbish.
So it's more just people wanting any answers to the problem than actually really believing in the core party policies then? My party leader was once campaigning in the streets and fiercely criticized by someone on this issue of migration. And this member of the public said, Geert Wilders is the only one who's actually addressing it. And then my party leader said, but do you believe in his solutions? And the lady said, no, that's what we have you for. So she's voting for Wilders to tell us to sort the solution, to sort the problem out. And it's very difficult for us to sort out the problem if everyone votes for Wilders. So that's the only thing, it's the only thing we have to.
Thank you. Let's go to the question right at the back on my right-hand side.
Hi, it's great to see you. Fraser, studying MPhil European Politics, and I have a question of procedure, speaking as you are the chair of the current ECOFIN and president of the Eurogroup. What is, within academia, we currently discuss this idea that within the Parliament and the Commission, well, it's certainly easy within the Parliament and to some extent within the Commission to follow what's happening in terms of legislative proposals. But when it comes to the council, everything is done behind closed doors. And there is this kind of feeling that when you're acting as a joint legislator, we should be able to see the amendments you are voting on. And certainly Simon Hicks and Sarah Hageman from the LSE gave evidence to the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago saying just this. I was wondering what your thoughts on this are as the current chair of the ECOFIN, and would this actually help to improve people's understanding of what their politicians are doing when they go to the EU?
I actually fully agree with that. I think that I would prefer the Eurogroup to be fully public, on camera, so that people can watch the debate. But that's a process which seems to go quite slow. So recently we've improved some things. We publish in advance an annotated agenda, so we tell this is what we're going to talk about, and this is roughly the issue. I publish after the meeting what's called a summing up letter, so I sort of sum up the debate and not just the conclusion. The conclusion can be one sentence, but people want to also understand what the actually debate was about. So that little things that help. Many of us, we are intergovernmental, so per definition the democratic legitimacy comes from national parliaments. Many of our ministers and me myself, we go to Parliament before and after Eurogroup meetings to in advance get a mandate. This is what we're going to discuss. I will take this position, the Parliament gives a mandate. So the democratic legitimacy for the Eurogroup is not related to the European Parliament, but it's related to national parliaments. I think that works. I don't think that's anti-democratic or ademocratic, but transparency, I think, nowadays is key. So it'll probably take a while, but we'll get there.
Would you say that in the UK, David Cameron should pledge to go to Parliament beforehand and gain a mandate? And do you also think that we should be able to see which amendments each country votes for?
The first question I didn't quite understand.
So at the moment, the debate on democratic deficit in the UK is quite stilted. And there isn't actually this knowledge that in countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, you go to Parliament beforehand and gain a mandate before you go to Brussels. This isn't actually debated. It hasn't been debated throughout this entire referendum period. We've had a very kind of stilted debate about the democratic deficit.
I think one of the good things is that the Brits can decide for themselves how they do the democratic legitimacy in their parliament. So they don't need me to come and say, George Osborne has to go to Parliament in advance to get a mandate. I leave that up to you. That's one of the things I like about the intergovernmental setup. The second thing is we don't actually vote on legislation in the Eurogroup. We take political decisions. ECOFIN, right. In ECOFIN, there are actually votes which are public, and if people put forward amendments and want changes, you can also see that. So we have the legislative part of our meetings is on camera and it's public, it's streamlined. But not the whole meeting, and that's of course why not the whole meeting. So sometimes we have very political debates on very political subjects with cameras off. I'm not very much in favour of that. I think that's something we should leave behind us. But as I said, we make some progress, but not enough yet.
Thank you. So we try and avoid jumping around too many different topics. I wonder if there are any more questions on ECOFIN and transparency. Yeah, we'll go to the question. Oh, no? There were some hands up.
Different topic.
Youssef, halfway down.
I have a question about the euro. Is that all right?
Yeah, let's go for a question about the euro. Go on then.
So I have a question about the euro. So there are many people who say that the long-term survival of the euro will involve some kind of a fiscal union, and I find that story plausible. On the other hand, given the sort of enormous sort of cultural and kind of political differences between countries, I can't quite imagine how that would work. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't think it's necessary. You can have a fiscal union. You could have a Eurozone budget. Some people also then want a Eurozone Minister of Finance. But the Eurozone budget, the main argument for that is always as a sort of economic buffer. So if there is a crisis in one member state, then you can use the fiscal capacity of the Eurozone to buffer that crisis, to help that country. Now I think that trying to think of an English word, the potential effect of that will always be a lot smaller than, let's say, the private capacity to buffer economic shocks. So if you look at the US, and there's a lot of research has been done there, how do economic shocks within the US in different states get buffered? Mainly by private investments and by the functioning of private markets. So if there is a crisis, investments is replaced, labor moves around, and in that way economic shocks get buffered in the US. And the effects of that is much, much stronger than any kind of sort of fiscal transfer. So that's why I'm very much in favor of having a well-functioning banking union, which is basically a common banking sector. That's why I'm very much in favor of developing a capital markets union, setting up a true capital market, which could really buffer economic shocks throughout the monetary union, throughout the EU 28. To deepen the internal market. There's this very strange thing that we have an internal market, which was sort of the core piece of our economic union, but the service sector is hardly a part of that. Service sectors are very much still nationally regulated and protected. So if we would do all those projects and do them well, finish the projects that we started, banking union, capital markets union, I think the effect of buffering economic shocks through well-functioning markets could be much, much stronger than having a sort of a budget where you can subsidize the unemployment benefit in country X, Y, or Z. By the way, I think that even if you have a very large fiscal capacity, a very large Eurozone budget, then the question, of course, is what's that money for? So if I look at national budgets, the biggest expenditures are healthcare, pensions, education, social security. Now, which one of those four would the electorate in the UK, well, the UK is not part of the Eurozone, which part of these four would the electorate in the Netherlands like to transfer to Brussels? The answer is none. And I think the same would go for the Germans and the French and the Spanish. If you ask them, do you want to transfer your pension system do you want to make that a European policy? I'm not so sure. Because it's very much the pension system is something that people like to keep close and like to be able to influence directly. And there are major differences in educational systems, in pension systems, in healthcare systems throughout the EU. And that's fine. But it's a major operation to say, let's make that a single common policy. So I always say, it could work, but how is it going to work? And I think a lot of work actually has to be done on this thinking about, some people, my Italian colleague has said we should have a European unemployment scheme throughout the monetary union. So if you look at how unemployment schemes in these 19 Eurozone countries work are very, very different. In some countries there are hardly any unemployment benefits, and in some countries they are very well developed pre-financed funds run by social partners, run by the unions. Major differences. Now in the countries that have these large unemployment funds run by social partners, if I would have to tell them from now on it's going to be a European scheme, those countries will probably lose out because they have such a wonderful system. So we keep underestimating in Europe how difficult it is to converge very different systems. We are still economically very much apart in many aspects. We are culturally still very much apart. So maybe over time this is a good idea, but I think a lot bigger effect would come from buffering economically by integrating markets and setting up capital markets banking union.
Thank you.
I hope that wasn't too much information.
And let's go to the question, the lady in the green jacket.
Thank you. In your earlier discussion, you mentioned the bilateral agreements with Switzerland. And I think you quite rightfully said that Switzerland is in a very difficult position with 19 agreements with the European Union. What, in your opinion, can Switzerland do to enhance its position?
Become a member? I don't think they want to. So, no, I mean, as you know, Switzerland tried to sort of distance itself from the free traffic of persons, but this is free movement of persons in the in the EU. But Switzerland is a part of that. So this case where the Swiss says we don't want to have this free movement anymore proves that if you have all these agreements with the EU, you have very limited space to then say, oh, I don't want to be part of this. So, you know, you can't expect just to have the advantages and then to pick and choose. And that's basically the position Switzerland is in. And you know, please, I'm not threatening you guys. Don't get me wrong. I'm just explaining how it works for Switzerland. So, the only way to really improve, I would say, is be part of the EU, sit at the table, then you can join discussions on how we manage migration or how we manage free movement, and influence it.
Thank you. Let's go to the question, lady in the second row.
Thank you very much for addressing us. I have a question regarding financial stability. Basically 3 questions. The first is, do you think that the financial reforms and regulation after the financial crisis have been effective? The second question is, what do you think are the biggest risks that the financial sector in Europe faces still? For example, would the European financial sector be able to survive an implosion of the Chinese economy? And the third question is, and you've talked a bit about it, I think already, is what major reforms do you think should still happen in the European Union to make the financial sector more resilient? Thank you.
All right. How much time do you have? I think we've established major improvements. Of course, not just in Europe, also in the US and in other parts. We have increased the capital requirements for banks, which is one of the key elements. You know, any other private company in our economy has high levels of equity, being able to carry losses and to take risks. Banks had minimum amounts of equity and simply couldn't carry any losses at all. In any other company, if there were losses to incur, then private investors would have to carry those, because the same private investors invested and taking a risk, which means that you take profit in the good times and you take losses in bad times. In the financial sector, we had the crazy principle of bailout, and we've been bailing out banks all during the crisis, which was extremely costly, economically nonsense, and completely the wrong incentive for future behavior of bankers. So we've now established the principle of bail-in in the EU. We've established high capital requirements. I think many of the supervisors were much too close, much too friendly with the banks. So now we've established more distance, at least in the banking union, a more distant supervisor who is in Frankfurt and supervises all of these banks, which I think is in itself already an improvement. So along many of these issues, we've improved. Is it effective? It's becoming effective. There are still a lot of legacy problems from the past. To give you an example, Italy bailed in a number of banks at the end of last year, but because some of these bank bonds were sold to private people, to households, to pensioners. That was a very harsh effect on these pensioners. They invested their pension in bank bonds thinking that they were safe, and now there is a new regime which says investors have to pay. So that's typically a legacy issue, something from the past. So luckily the Italians are still saying the principle is good, we must maintain these new rules, but we need to do something to compensate these poor pensioners, which I politically understand. So this is just one example. Another example is many, and this is also one answer to your second question, what is one of the remaining risks? Many European banks still have a lot of non-performing loans on their bank balance sheets from private companies that have simply failed or are failing to do their payments, to repay their loans. And that has a number of effects on the banks. One is that there is very little scope to put out new credit to well-functioning companies. If your whole portfolio is locked up by guys who are simply not paying back their loans, you have very little loans to put out. And of course, it's a risk in the bank balance sheets. So that has to be dealt with. And again, here, Italy is now taking a number of initiatives to start to deal with that, where other countries have already done it or still have to do it. So also here, legacy, still things from the past to clear up. And then there is a number of things which we still have to do. We've built a banking union, so we now have single rule books, capital requirements at a much higher level, single supervisor, distant and objective. We have a resolution authority which will make the investors take their losses, the bail-in principle. But we don't yet have a common deposit guarantee system, which ensures that if a bank does fail and go bust, that the depositors will always, up to a certain limit, get their money back. We have now common rules which also apply to the UK, that every country must have a deposit guarantee system. But for the banking union, at some point we want to join that and make it one fund, which is of course much stronger and much more credible. So that still needs to be established. Some of the capital requirements need to be improved. The minimum requirement for the leverage ratio, let's say the real equity for banks, is now at 3%. That's much too low. In the Netherlands, we've said it's at 4%, which is still too low, but at least it shows, we're saying it needs to go up. And some economists say it needs to be at least 10 or 20%. So in the future, it needs to go up. So there's still work to do, but I sincerely believe we've made big steps here in improving the solidity of our banks. We're in a different phase than we were before the financial crisis. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go to the question right on the front row.
Thanks very much for your interesting talk and your insights. I'm wondering whether if the Brexit actually happens, which we should take seriously right now, will it actually be a driver for more European integration in the Eurozone? So, as an example, would we get rid of the European Banking Authority sitting in London, and will we give powers that that the EBA has today? Will we actually give it to the ECB in the new banking union? So, will we actually maybe experience a drive towards more integration?
I think we'll still need an EBA, and as we still have a very large financial sector in London, let's keep EBA. Yes, there are people in continental Europe that say, well, if the Brits leave, we must quickly move ahead. But I think they very much underestimate that the same debate that you guys have in the UK is going on all over Europe. Which for me is another argument to say to the Brits, just stay in and join the debate in Europe. I mean, it's not like a typical British debate, it's everywhere. So let's jointly improve the effectiveness of what we're doing in Europe. But if, some argue that if the Brits leave, we must quickly move ahead, take big steps. I don't think there is a lot of public support. I think it completely underestimates the core issue, which is we want more results from Europe, which is not necessarily the same as let's take on the next big project in Europe. And that brings me back to my earlier point. Let's make sure that the things that we now do jointly, which I believe in, but let's make them effective. Let's finish the projects. Let's make the Schengen Treaty work the way it was supposed to work, and complete it with a joint asylum procedure. Let's finish the banking union. Let's finish the internal market. Let's finish what we do instead of, and maybe that is deepening of the union. I would say that's just finishing what we have already agreed. We don't have a very strong track record in that. But taking the next step, I don't think that's very wise. Already the whole institutional setup is weak because we haven't finished the previous projects. It's like setting up a building. You keep adding new parts, but you haven't even finished the plumbing on the first part, and the wires are still hanging out of the roof, and you need to fix the roof on the shed before you put on another bathroom on the east wing, and this is kind of the way we're muddling through with the EU. So let's go back to the original casco and finish it. Put some windows in.
Thank you. Let's go to the question about halfway back on my right-hand side.
The ECB has recently come under attack to a certain extent in Europe. I mean, Wolfgang Schäuble blamed the ECB's policies for the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, and not just the German, but also your government in the Netherlands have criticised the ECB's policy of low or negative rates. Are you committed to the independence of the ECB, from government policy? But also, what are your thoughts as Finance Minister on what the ECB is doing and what it plans to do, and what the possibilities for, monetary stimulus, etc., the ECB has left?
Answering your first question would also exclude me answering your second. So your first question is, do you respect the ECB's independence? And my answer is yes. I come from a long-standing Dutch tradition that we feel that monetary policy should be done by independent central bankers. That also means that leading politicians should refrain from criticizing or giving guidance to the central bankers. It's not just about legislating them and telling them what to do, it's also about publicly criticizing them, which is also putting political pressure on the decision-making process. Having said that, I've just answered your second question, which is, what do you think of the ECB policies? I'd like not to comment on that.
Thank you. Let's go to the question.
By the way, on a more serious note, I think people have to realize, and that doesn't seem to, not everyone seems to realize that the ECB needs to work for the whole Eurozone. And the ECB's mandate is not to ensure that there are high enough interest rates on for savers in Germany or the Netherlands. I would like for savers and pensioners in the Netherlands to have high interest rates, but that is not the core mandate of the ECB. The core mandate of the ECB is to have financial stability and to create an inflation which is close to but below 2%. That's its mandate, and within that mandate they have a very large scope of freedom what they can do. But some countries feel that if the effects of that policy in the short term are negative for one part of their electorate, that can't be the right policy. I don't think that's correct. Mario Draghi has to consider the economic situation in the Eurozone over the whole of the Eurozone, within his mandate. And as long as he does that, I will defend what he does.
The gentleman in the blue shirt in the second row.
You've been criticized quite heavily within your own party for the way you handled the crisis in Greece. For example, last year, the youth movement within your party gave you the award for the least social democrat, essentially, the Verwelkte Roos.
You are very well informed, sir.
I wonder how you would respond to such criticism, and whether you think, or what you think of the criticism that Europe should have pursued policies that would have been more social in Greece and would have put less burdens on the weakest in Greece.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's only the third time in my party that people have tried to kick me out, so I don't take it too seriously anymore. The fact is that Greece really needs to take difficult measures, and I'd be the last to sort of, deny that. That's absolutely true. But I wouldn't call them antisocial. For example, the pension system in Greece is totally unsustainable, and there is not a proper sort of unemployment benefits system instead. So whole families depend on the pension system, for which it's not designed. It's financially unsustainable because the contributions to the pension system are by far not enough to do the payments. So yes, a major reform of the pension system is now taking place, setting up of large pension funds, making them financially sustainable, and at the same time developing a new social security system to take that huge pressure off the pension system. So the pension system becomes what it should be for pensioners. But these are big changes in any society. I mean, I know how politically sensitive it is to change anything in a pension system. But they're not antisocial. We're doing, and we're helping the Greeks with this to really set up their tax revenue services. Because tax fraud is massive in Greece, and you cannot build a social society if there is not a fair and effective tax system. And that is a major operation which will take years, but it's already given off good effects. Tax revenues last year for the first time went up, even though they were still in a recession, because the government was committed to improve the tax system. So, but that does mean that people have to start paying taxes, which is not a very popular thing, certainly not if you're in an economic crisis. But it needs to happen to start building up the country. A third example, and then I'll stop, was on the privatizations. The Germans in the negotiation said there needs to be a very large privatization fund, and that was controversial. There was also a fairness in it. I could understand it, that the Germans made this an important point, because the Greeks have really huge numbers of state-owned companies and state-owned real estate. Something like 15,000 state-owned companies, small and large, 45,000 objects of real estate owned by the state. And this is of course a strange situation when on the other hand you have a huge debt and you're borrowing money to sustain public spending. So the thinking is maybe there is money to be made there to help pay off the debt. In the process of negotiation, we've changed it from a privatization fund to a privatization and investment fund. So if the Greeks have revenues from all of these companies, either by exploiting, making them profitable, or selling them, that part of that can also be reinvested in Greece, and part of it needs to go to the repayment of debt. So already that has become a more fair system, and that was part of the agreement on Monday, how it's going to function. So I still defend what we're doing, even though I realize these are major changes in a country which is already economically hit badly. But if you look at the kind of changes we're doing, I think it will really improve the way the public system works, the tax system works, the economy works.
But regardless of these specific policy reforms that might or might not have been necessary and good and beneficial, it is still a fact that if you look at poverty rates, if you look at healthcare, education, at suicide rates and all of those numbers, that the Greeks have been suffering really terribly over the past few years. And regardless of these policy specifics, one could argue that that's simply an unacceptable situation in a European country. And rather many social democratic parties argue that part of Europe and part of the European Union is that there should be this basis of solidarity, that such suffering doesn't have to take place, regardless of what kind of technicalities or what kind of technical policy reforms would have to take place for the long term.
The saddest thing about Greece is that there is a lot of wealth, but it's carefully tucked away so that the Internal Revenue Service doesn't see it, or it's moved to London. So also in Greece, it's very much a question of distribution and of fairness of public systems. And if you have a deficit, at the beginning of the crisis in Greece, there was a deficit, when the real figures were finally put on the table, a deficit of minus 15%. What do you expect your European partners to do? To finance that year in, year out, and then not make you pay it back? Because that's, of course, part of the deal is, okay, if the Greeks sort of sort out their budgetary issues and reform the way their government works, then we'll help the Greeks manage their debt. That's the phase we're in now. That's the debt talks we're now. But if we would have said, well, you don't have to sort out your budget, we'll simply finance you, how sustainable is that? I don't think that's the right approach. But then, of course, you can argue, have we designed it in the right way? We had a conversation before coming into this room about the first program for the Greeks. So the Greek society, the Greek economy was, before the crisis, heavily over-credited. Much too much credit went into the country. And in the first program, there was a major bailout of French and German banks and other European banks who supplied all this credit. Part of the truth is also that they did take a hit. They took about 50% of losses, but 50% they were given back. And these loans were taken over by the European funds, the new European emergency funds. Looking back at it, I think that was a mistake. I think there should have been a full bail-in, which would have meant that Greece now would have had a much lower sovereign debt. And that's the approach we did in Cyprus. In Cyprus, when the banks collapsed, we didn't bail them out, and we forced the people who had big amounts of money in the bank, investors, etc., to take a hit. And we did a bail-in of those investors, which means that Cyprus is now out of the program with a relatively low sovereign debt and out of a recession. So the approach in the Cypriot program, which as a matter of principle, much better, but also economically has worked out much better. So looking back, but the first Greek program, like in many other countries, we should have done a bail-in instead of a bailout. But then others would argue, but in the midst of a crisis, it's impossible to do a bail-in because it would cause tremendous financial instability. And that's probably true also. So I'm very happy that we've put the bail-in principle now in all of our legislation, so that in the next crisis, we don't have to improvise, we don't have to do bailouts, we'll do bail-ins.
We'll go for one final question from the member in the third row.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, this is a bit different. I was just wondering about to go back to like referenda, the recent rejection of the Ukraine agreement in the Netherlands, and what your what steps your government were taking from that, and what impact you think that will have on the Dutch relationship with the EU and like opinion within the Netherlands.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I wish I had the answer. I very much campaigned for the treaty with the Ukraine. I think the Ukraine deserves our support, and the Ukrainian people have in a strong majority said they want to work as closely as possible with the EU. So I think the reason why a majority of those people that actually voted rejected the treaty was very much very little to do with Ukraine and very much to do with the EU. So they said, well, this is again an expansion of the EU in political power, in territorial expansion, we're provoking Putin, which is a very big mistake, etc., etc. So it was very much against the EU and not so much against the Ukraine. And it fits in with all sentiment that we spoke about, the Euroscepticism, which is all around Europe. I hope that the effect for the Ukraine will be as little as possible. Part of the treaty is actually between the EU as a whole and the Ukraine, so that can continue. Part of the treaty may have to be revised or renegotiated, but the Dutch government still feels that we should support as much and as broad as we can the Ukraine in all its challenges.
Do you think the Netherlands is almost as Eurosceptic as Britain?
Or more so?
Or more so?
I don't know. It's different. We've been a part of the sort of founding fathers of the European project right from the beginning. So I think in that sense it's deeper engraved in the Dutch history. We are of course a continental country, and the UK is typically a island culture. So I think in many respects it's different. But yes, the criticism of the EU, the balance of the good things and the bad things that it brings, people feel it's become very imbalanced. Like the UK, we pay more than we get out of it, so we have that debate. We are one of the sort of recipient countries of the migration influx of the last couple of years. So to a lot of people, being part of Europe is at the moment not a very attractive proposal.
But you can't see a Dexit coming anytime soon?
Dexit, Nexit. No, I don't think so. I think there is still a majority pro-EU. Secondly, I think that in the coming years, if we manage the migration crisis, and at the moment it seems to be managed better than it was last year, if economic growth keeps improving, and it's been improving now for a number of years, in small steps, but every year economic growth in the Netherlands and other Euro countries is stronger. So I think if we have more real life arguments for people why the European cooperation is not such a bad idea, I think we can also manage the exit debate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening, but the Minister has kindly agreed to come and join us for a drink in the bar, so do come and continue the conversation in there. In the meantime, please join me in thanking once again Jeroen Dijsselbloem.